Welcome to the Creative Play and Podcast Network. Join us as we share our favorite RPGs, one-shot games, tabletop games, reviews, and convention panels. Sit back and enjoy the show.
Hi, this is Kelly, aka Trixie from Ragnarok and Roll, a Scion to Ragnarok story, and Tilda Wimblewick from D&D Journey of the 5th Edition. First off, I would just like to say thank you to everyone for listening to our varied adventures, as well as for rating us on iTunes and RPGpodcast.com. If you haven't rated us yet, we would greatly appreciate it if you could. And if you're looking for more ways to support our efforts, we are now on Patreon, a great site where you can help us continue making more podcasts, as well as some special surprises for our patrons. If you can, please look us up at www.patreon.com/cppn. Every little bit helps. And again, thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to Minorities in Science Fiction and Fantasy, where we will talk about something tangential to that in some way. I guess my name is Wendy Trakes. I'm here as the fan representation. I am not an author, but I had asked about this panel to happen because I think it's a conversation, especially when we're seeing more representation of underrepresented communities in both in all of fandom, from film to books and stuff. I wanted to hear input from folks who do the creation, and so I was like, I want this panel. They went, great, you're on it.
Hi, I'm Mary. I write sci-fi and fantasy, mostly for young adults. These are two of my titles: Stronger Than a Bronze Dragon, which is about a girl who slays demons, and Found Footage, which is about a cryptid. It's about Mantis Man. I also co-edit the Brave New Girls anthology series, which, by the way, is currently open for... Oh, thanks.
You can use that one for the...
All right, display copy of Star Swept. I also co-edit the Brave New Girls anthologies about girls doing techie things in sci-fi worlds, which, by the way, are currently open for submissions. So if you're interested, you can go to my website, and then there's a link to Brave New Girls there, or it's bravenewgirls.weebly.com. Yeah, that's me.
Hi, I'm Tamsin Silver, and I'm an author with Falstaff Books. And I write both urban fantasy and historical fantasy. My urban fantasy is a lot of strong female heroes, and I have a web series out called Sky of the Damned. My most recent is my Billy the Kid series, which is real history Billy the Kid that I've wrapped in Irish folklore, and book 3 just came out in September. So we're happy to finally have the whole set out. Writing during a pandemic was not a good time. And so that's me. That's really all there is. Next.
I'm Marcus Campbell. I'm a poet from Mesa, Arizona. I write for Brick Cave Media. It's a fantasy, sci-fi, and poetry publisher out of Mesa. So I'm here mainly to learn and get to know everybody as I'm writing my first novels. That's my first collection of
Wonderful.
Good to be here with everybody.
So, well, I guess since I asked for this panel, I should probably ask some questions.
As we've kind of decided, you're the moderator.
Yeah.
We've never made this decision.
I was talking to Mary a little bit before. There's a lot of reasons why I'm interested in this. My background is in anthropology and history, and so I've done a lot of nonfiction reading about underrepresented communities and social inequality and things like that. But it wasn't until much later in my adult life that I realized the majority of the science fiction and fantasy that I consumed as a young adult, as a teen, as an adult, were written by white men and some white women with no representation in the characters. And it wasn't until then that I actively started seeking out other fiction, and I love it just as much, if not more. There's different authors. Right now I'm obsessed with M.P. Jennison, and if you haven't read anything by her, anything you pick up is going to be an adventure. But that was part of the reason why I was just like, I think this kind of panel would be really interesting to hear the feedback from people who create materials that we consume that may not fit or don't fit into that original traditional norm of science fiction, white men, white women, colonial kind of viewpoints, and bring other cultures that aren't Western American or European culture into these fictions that we love, these fandoms that we love. So now I need to come up with a question. I'm not used to TusCon and moderating, so because we don't. But
we could all just start with our individual spiels, I guess.
That was kind of what I was wanting to get at. So if there's any if you want to go down the line and kind of maybe touch on those topics.
Sure. So I am Chinese American. My parents were immigrants. They came to the States in the 80s for grad school and then just kind of settled down, and I was born here. Here's the thing about growing up as a kid in the 90s and who's Chinese American in North Carolina, by the way.
Oh.
You were the only one.
Yes.
And so you didn't even realize sometimes that you were Chinese. You were just I'm a kid like everybody else, and so you watch the same TV as everybody else, and if you watch Star Trek, everybody's look, Star Trek, it's pretty diverse, right? But you don't think about it when you're a kid, and then you start growing up, and then everything around you is white. I love Star Wars, for example, but it's mostly white. And that starts being your default. So I remember the very first time I wrote a book, I was 12 years old. It was a space adventure, and the crew was all white. Because to me, this is what space crews were like, just because I grew up in North Carolina, I watched the same TV as everybody else. I'm not thinking, ooh, I'm going to represent Chinese people I was 12. I just wanted to write a space story, and to me, space stories were white. Fast forward 10 years, I'm now 22, and I've been through college. I sit down to write my first novel, and I made the main character white again, because that is just where my brain defaulted to. And then eventually I was kind of wait, I'm the one writing it though. Can't I make her Asian? And then I was wait, that feels like going too far. We'll make her half Asian. We'll compromise, which is a whole problem by itself, because of course being biracial is an identity by itself. It's not a compromise, but that's where my mind went, just because of all this baggage I was carrying with me. And it wasn't until, I think, Stronger Than a Bronze Dragon that I wrote something that felt like Asian, because it takes place in an alternate China kind of thing. But the weird thing about being Chinese American is I am first and foremost American. I grew up in North Carolina. I moved to New Jersey when I was 14. For many years I was the only Asian kid in my school, and you didn't run around saying, I'm Asian. You just you tried to fit in, and I think that's why most of my fiction, even though I'm a Chinese American author, isn't what people would think of as Chinese American fiction. It is not about the immigrant experience. It's not about being the only Asian kid in school. I didn't want to write that. I already lived it. Why would I want to write it? And so I feel you get pressure from both sides. First they were saying you can't hide Chinese people at all, and now they're saying you're not Chinese enough. That's my spiel.
I'm super white. So I'm not a minority at all. Super Scottish and British and French and German, and everybody's oh, I did my DNA test. I said, yep, mine just shows I'm super white. I'm very European. But I have been writing stories since I'm old enough that basically my writing started on an electric typewriter in the basement in Michigan. And of course, I always wrote stories about people who were white, because that's all I saw on TV, and that's all my family was, and that's all that was in Michigan that I knew of. And then I started getting older, and I started realizing my school was definitely a mix of color, because it was Michigan, and we had a lot of African American, we had a lot of different, and then when I went to school, Western Michigan University, there's a large Asian population there, and it's just wonderful because they still speak their native language, and so it was just wonderful to me, and I was just this is what I love. And I moved to New York City, and if you want a melting pot of everything, and you get to see it on the subway, and they're all sitting next to each other
and ignoring each other
because they're busy listening to their own music and hanging out. But when I started really writing, I because I was living in New York, and because I'd reached a point where I really liked diverse representation, and not because it was something people were talking about, yes, but that's what I saw. So my first series, the Windfire series, the witches, I made, one of them is African American, one of them is Japanese, one of them is, and because that's what I saw, that's what I was used to seeing where I lived, was a diverse group of people, and I wanted that in my book. Moon Over Manhattan is a new series coming out, and when I was creating the Wolf Pack, I was very intentional. And again, this was in 2010, before people were like, you need to be diverse. But I was like, I want someone who is from India. I want someone in the pack who is African American. I want someone who, like, I wanted this diverse team. It was important to me to see that because that was what I lived. I saw it all the time and I loved it. And it's one of the reasons why when I moved from New York City to New Mexico, because New Mexico, you would think, oh, is that diverse? It is. There's like 19 different tribes. And I love the fact that you can hear different things when you walk through the hospital I work in. And so to me, the world has always been a little more, even though it's primarily been white, there's always been a diverse, and I think that to me, as a writer and as a person, it's always been what I thrived on and what I enjoyed most about living there. And so I made sure that I put that in my books because I thought it was important.
I'm a poet, so diversity for me is a matter of like reflecting on the individual communities that I'm speaking on, or speaking of, or for. Well, I guess not for, that's the wrong word. Attempting to express the feelings or opinions of a particular group. So I guess mine is a little bit different. Diversity for me may be a little bit less intentional. I don't necessarily pick a character, right? A lot of the characters that would come up from poetry are real. I can't necessarily change my character when I go to write. I mentioned in one of my previous panels that one of the benefits of fiction is that if you write I in fiction, they don't assume it's the author. If I write I in a poem, they automatically assume it's me. So there is no option to not be diverse if I'm in a brown body. So that was never an option. So I always kind of dove into it head on. I mean, if we're talking about representation in fantasy and sci-fi, I'm kind of curious what everybody thought this was going to be about. That's an excellent question. Because minorities in fantasy and sci-fi, or diversity in fantasy and sci-fi, could mean a lot of things. Like, are we responding to the modern attempts at inputting diversity into sci-fi? Did people want to talk about Afrofuturism or something else? Like
that would be a whole 3, 4, 5.
Yeah.
So it's almost do I get to just talk about House of the Dragon for the next 35 minutes? I've been telling everybody that I've been angling to do. That's been my angle, but I think it's a really big conversation. I think that we're starting to have it now is really important. I think that's part of the reason, you said, for a while there I was too Asian, now I'm not Asian enough. I think there's going to be waves of that back and forth as we kind of move through different things. Because I think part of the difficulties that we're experiencing now is we have spent so much time consuming primarily white Western European media that we almost don't know what else we want. As a consumer base, we don't know where we want it, we don't know how we want it, so we're kind of throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks right now. Like we're like, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars. And so I think that's part of the pushback that we're getting right now, is that we're really just trying things to see what sticks, because we don't know what plays in terms of diversity. We don't know what people want to see outside of typecasting and outside of stereotyping.
Right.
So I'm really excited and curious to see not only what the authors on this panel can do, but I guess what you guys have to ask, what you guys have to say.
The conversation's always shifting too. Like I was saying on another panel, it's like, look, the advice I would have given 10 years ago is completely the opposite of the advice I give today, because the conversation has changed. Like, people tried something and that's the advice you got 10 years ago, and then it didn't work, so now we're giving different advice.
You guys, you've brought up several different directions that we could go in this, from writing from your own identity and looking outside for other communities to incorporate into your writing, like Tamsin has, and or in your case, you're not writing from a Chinese identity, you're writing from an American identity, and so there's a different kind of feel than somebody who is, say, I'm going to write to represent Chinese people in the American, in the Western fiction, right, or in science fiction. So that's one bent that we could go on. The other one is this throwing things at the wall to see what sticks, which to me is fascinating. The Wheel of Time series, actually, the the TV series came to mind because there was a huge blowback on the diversity of casting because people read those books and all the characters were a certain way in their head, and that happens in fiction. When you read, you envision the characters, right? And so when they weren't the ethnicity or the skin tone or the background that was imagined from the book, there was huge blowback on that. And we've seen it in other shows too, where they've cast because they're like, there was nothing in the book. And Sandman, there are some indications in the book that, for example, that Death in the comic they drew a pale white girl. Well, there's nothing in the character that says that that's what she has to look like all the time, right? So there's been all this public pushback, and I think that you're right. I think it's that we're throwing it at the wall to see what works. And some of the stuff works beautifully because it really shows the community and the characters.
Ms. Marvel is a great
Ms.
example of that.
I was going to stick with Death. I think Death and Sandman was a good example.
Death. That is from the
fun.
series. Death was my favorite character in the comic and in the graphic novel and in the series.
Some people forget that before Samuel L. Jackson, Nick Fury was always an old white man with gray hair.
And the minute he was in, all the figures changed that they were selling, and all of a sudden,
even in the comic, they're just like,
all of a sudden, Nick Fury just changed in the comic over, and I was like, well done.
And now no one can imagine anybody else than Nick Fury.
No one.
Went back and changed the source material.
I'm just curious as to
there would be none.
What direction you guys would be interested in going in this conversation?
Well, I have a
want to talk
question.
about.
Yeah, I think we had two
some
questions.
and we'll see where that goes.
Okay, let's go that way.
Well, Star Wars came up, and I was going to say I thought that the last trio of they were a lot more diverse. They had. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting people's names at this point, but they did have a black guy, and they had a Korean woman, and the women in it in general had a lot of leadership roles.
Yeah.
So I just wondered to me that felt really good to see more diversity. Like, why wouldn't you have diversity if you're,
So I have some
if it's this multi-universe or multi.
So I have some thoughts about that. So I loved The Force Awakens, and that was one where you could tell they were really trying to diversify their cast. They cast John Boyega as basically the main character, along with Daisy Ridley, and they had Oscar Isaac also as a co-lead, and so that was pretty awesome. And then along comes The Last Jedi, which was controversial for many reasons, but the one that really bothered me was they completely sidelined their minority characters. They made that movie all about, the white main girl and then the white male villain. And the way the thing was written, even though Kelly Marie Tran and John Boyega got lots of screen time, their story was kind of inconsequential. Even fans of The Last Jedi will sometimes be like, I don't know what was going on with that side plot because the main plot was about Rey and Kylo Ren. So that was an example of someone who had great intentions. I'm sure Rian Johnson was like, look at me, I'm going to bring in an Asian woman to be a main character. I'm going to bring back John Boyega to have a storyline, and yet he didn't know what to do with them. And John Boyega has actually in an interview expressed some frustration. Of course he's still a professional, so he didn't call anyone out by name, but just if you read the interview, read between the lines, you could tell he was frustrated by the direction his character went in, because his character started off as almost the new Luke Skywalker type. He was set up to be the hero of the new trilogy, and then in movie number 2 he's completely sidelined. Movie number 3, they tried to fix it, but it was kind of too late. By that point, everyone's focus had just shifted to these 2 white characters.
And you have a different director at that point too, so it makes it
Yeah.
better director. So back
And then of course in movie number 3, all of Kelly Marie Tran's lines could probably fit into a single tweet.
Aw, that poor girl.
And John Boyega's would be the 2 quote tweets following it. He didn't have very many lines in the third one either.
Yep.
Yeah, there were also implications that he was going to get force powers that were kind of sidelined. So there's a lot of attempts at diversity that I guess would be best described as disingenuous. So I guess as we move towards doing diversity that's genuine, and moving away from doing diversity that's as almost like blaxploitation was, where it's a metric of commerce, where in order to make our movie more profitable, we're going to throw a couple people in it so we can throw them on a poster. So one, we need to be able to recognize that as as consumers of media, and two, as writers of media. We need to be careful to not do it ourselves.
Oh, you know what's a weird example? So there's this opera, Carmen, from the 1800s.
Yes.
And in the 1930s or 40s, they adapted it into a Broadway musical where they took the same music and rewrote the lyrics and cast it with all African Americans, which was kind of an interesting artistic choice. And they actually made a movie of it, and I watched the movie, and I was like, I have such mixed feelings about this movie, because on the one hand, you gave this performance opportunity to all these black actors who might otherwise not have gotten to shine on the silver screen. I think the main actress actually got nominated for an Oscar or something. On the other hand, like, a lot of the dialect is very, like, stereotypical. Like, they do the whole, like, I apostrophe S thing, like, I is going to do this, and I'm like, it was like an interesting attempt where it's like, it was well-intentioned, but it kind of was like, something about this feels off.
Yeah.
Yes. So this brought. I would been thinking of many wonderful comments and questions. You guys are fantastic, but you really brought up something with the Carmen adaptation, and that is sensitivity readers and having people come in to make certain that what you are creating, especially if you're not an own voices writer, is going to actually be thoughtful, sensitive, and well handled. And what are some of your thoughts on sensitivity readers, especially with something like Star Wars that could have had the budget for it and could have used a staff of sensitivity readers, right?
I've done sensitivity readers because again, as I mentioned, I like to write diverse, but I also want to make sure I'm not wrong. I've got a short story in the book We Are Not This, and it's an entire book that we did with my publisher. Do you remember when the bathroom bill was going on in North Carolina?
Oh, yeah.
And one of the big hashtags that people were saying was "We Are Not This," and that's this book. And so all of the short stories that are centered around LGBTQ+, it's all the proceeds of it go to support the LGBTQ people in North Carolina. And so we all signed away rights for getting paid for this. And I wrote this short, and I just loved it. It's called The Color of Love, and but it has two young men in it. One of color, and I was like, first off, not male, second, not of color, third, not gay. So I was like, I need a sensitivity reader, and I found someone who read it, and they pointed out a few things that they said, you are close, but I would change this word here, and I would change this, and I was like, fantastic. And what was great is this, I want to put out something people love. I want to put out something people enjoy, and I don't want them to hit roadblocks of things that are wrong, and I want to make sure it's good for people. And so I think sensitivity readers are fantastic. They also make me feel more secure when I release that book, that I'm on the nose. Like, I spent 6 years doing research on all the Billy the Kid stuff so I could get that history as exact as possible. So there's nothing different for me as a writer between saying, okay, I need to do history, I need to know my history as much as I also need someone to read and correct me if I'm wrong on something that I'm writing that isn't me.
That's a really good point for the usefulness of sensitivity readers, because you can research all day long, but you don't have the same experience.
I don't have.
It's like if you're writing a legal drama, sending it to a lawyer.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly. It's the same kind of thing. You want somebody who's living with the experience of the character that you're writing, whether it's a lawyer, whether it's me writing an African American man. I have no experience. I can see what has happened on the outside. I can read about it and I can postulate, but I don't know how that feels. I'll never know how that feels. I'll never know what those experiences are when I'm not looking. Right. So. Yes. So to have that kind of reader, regardless of what it is, profession, identity, or anything, I think it's super valuable. And I think that Hollywood needs to use it a lot more.
I think so.
Yeah. This is another thing where the conversation has kind of evolved, though, because sensitivity readers became a thing, I feel like really around like 2014, 2015, it became really popular. And then what was starting to happen, though, was some of these sensitivity readers were getting thrown under the bus. because somebody would send them a manuscript being like, this is the manuscript from like the publisher, it's basically done, just make sure like we didn't write anything extremely insensitive there.
Right.
So they
make sure we don't offend anybody.
Yeah, so they read it and they would, do their best, and they have no control over what comments get incorporated and what don't. And the book comes out, and then, book Twitter or something says this part is racist. Well, then the publisher then goes, we had a sensitivity reader, it's their fault. And so,
we did.
That's rude and wrong.
No, you didn't. And I think, but I was going to point out really to Star Wars and that effect too. It does sound like or feel like the decision makers at the very end may have had a lot to do with pulling and cherry picking and taking. If I don't know the backstory, and I'm sure that people who are more familiar with the later Star Wars series and the media behind it, the behind the scenes stuff that people have written and everything, as to how much was actually left on the cutting room floor of these characters.
Exactly.
Because the producers were of the same mentality that Disney was when The Last Airbender came out, the live action. And they're like, well, yeah, of course we cast white people because Americans are ready to watch Asian people on the screen.
Yeah, and had an Indian director.
And then G comes out and
But you had, I'm sorry, you had a question.
I was going to ask, because I think the conversation's really nuanced, and I think whenever people, they call things out and they say, I don't think that character should have been this demographic, or this character, this demographic, because sometimes people want to say, oh, well, that's because you're racist, and it's like, it's not always necessarily the case, you know what I mean? Like, the conversation is more nuanced than that, so, I don't know.
If we're talking about like existing characters, like changing existing characters, like that was a problem with like Witcher, for instance. Witcher had a lot of backlash for changing the races of existing characters in like properties that were like really beloved. Then we start to get into like questions about like adaptation and like how faithful is adaptation like to begin with, and you're saying it's like really nuanced. If the disqualifying factor, here's the problem: if the only criticism of a show is that, then that brings up questions of racism. It's like, oh, the show was perfect, but they went and changed their race to a black woman. If that's the criticism, then that's a questionable criticism. And I think that's what people are pushing back at. If the criticism is, I hate that actress, that has absolutely nothing. I don't know why I went to actress, but I think with the circumstance of Witcher, it was, I believe, particular female characters. I'm not familiar with that property, but I believe it was female character that was beloved and the race was changed. But, Did somebody know?
I think it was Tris.
Okay, yeah. So I believe they changed a pretty pivotal female character's race, and so people were annoyed by that. But there was very little talk about the actual quality of the actress, or how what was her speaking cadence like? So one of the things about Samuel L. Jackson is that he really does a Nick Fury, right? So did she do a Trish? That wasn't the conversation. The conversation was that the race of the character had changed.
And something that people will often say when, filmmakers try to diversify their cast is, well, you should just cast the best person for the role and not try to, force, diversity or whatever. It's like, well, what if the right person for the role, like the best actress in that role was a person of color?
And
what if she was just a better actress?
If you watch Neil Gaiman burn people about Sandman, a lot of his point is he cast the best person for the role. It didn't matter.
It's like, why do you always assume that the best person,
Colorblind casting.
In the movie, excuse me 1 second, Jesus Christ Superstar, people complained that Judas was a black actor. He says, you're trying to negate, or you put, negative things on the black people. And he went, no, he showed up and gave the best audition. Was I not supposed to hire him because he was black?
Meanwhile, let's go back to the fact that Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jew.
But another example in that kind of that same vein would be Night of the Living Dead. I think it was Night of the Living Dead. Yeah. The George A. Romero. That was an example of colorblind casting. He didn't go in looking for a black man. He just went in. The black man was the best man for the role. And then when you get to the ending of the film, where it has that kind of very Lynchy vibe to it, where it almost that feels like a lynching is occurring. They didn't actually write that after they found the black actor. That was the tone of the scene before they found the black actor. And then when they got to the end, the studio said, "You're going to change that end?" He said, "Nope." Why would I change the end? Right? So there's a certain amount of integrity involved in colorblind casting that I'm not sure the industry is quite ready for.
Well, is the audience ready for it either, too? Or do you
I think the audience is a lot more ready for it than we give them credit for. I think the audience is more ready than we give them credit for.
And I think the people who aren't ready, well then, darn, guess what?
Yeah.
Become ready.
Yeah, I think the audience is a lot
the world
more
is
ready than we give them credit
multi-diverse,
for.
and you need to step into it.
Related to that, like one of the things that they have been studying is that when people read a book or watch a long-running TV series, they have a lot more empathy. It increases their empathy in general, but also towards specific people. So I think it's really critical. I mean, like, okay, I grew up like real evangelical, and I thought that gay people were like really evil. And then I read, brain death. I'm sorry, the guy who wrote Hal, Ginsberg, his elegy for his lover and about his lover's ashes, and that was, I can still remember when I read that poem, that was the first time I realized that those were real people with real feelings that loved each other, and that totally like changed my life, and it wasn't even a long poem. So I think that representation of everybody is really important.
Yes. In the mainstream. And that was kind of my initial point of wanting to do a panel like this, or at least see a panel like this, was because, like I said, what I consumed as a teenager and as a younger adult represented me as a white European individual, and I never saw anything else that way. I grew up halfway in the South Pacific, so I had more exposure. When I lived in the United States, my neighborhood was white. The people I hung out with were white, and it wasn't like there was any kind of overt or active racism. It's just that this was what was available. It was on TV. This was the general consumption, and so being able to see that representation and having raised a kid with more and more stuff being on television and more diversity and everything. There's a lot, I'm noticing it, especially with younger generations. There's a lot more just like, oh yeah, there's more out there. It's not just us, right? So you had a comment?
I've done some various studies of European culture, and what I found surprising is that we culturally, us white people, like to be bigots. Because if you look into that, we are bigoted against each other. I once saw this chart with 16 different Caucasian types and their tribal backgrounds. And this is one group of Caucasians warning another about what to be careful of.
Look out for the curly-haired white woman.
Yes, when
makes me sick.
Our ancestors came here, they may not have known they were bringing this with them, but they had been culturally trained to think that way. Right. And when they find someone different looking, they just immediately pick it up again. I don't know what I'm saying exactly, other than the fact that we culturally were trained to do that, and now we have to somehow deprogram it.
And that's going to take just as much time, I think. But I think so. in media, and this has been a great conversation on this, is that the media is becoming more diverse, whether it's well-intentioned or just we're going to put it on this because people want more diversity. We're going to put this diverse, this black character, or this Chinese character, or whatever, and on the poster because we want more people to come in and really just pay lip service to making them real characters in the script or in the book or in the story or whatever. I think the more that we make that the norm, or not the exploitation, but make the norm where we're showing people, representing people, being people, doing people things, regardless. And there's still, and that I'm not saying you ignore the history and the cultural nuances and all of that goes with it, But the more you see the history and the cultural nuances and things like that in general mainstream, the more you're just like, oh, well, yeah, so that's normal. I think the bias just starts to decrease the more exposure. But some people are going to dig their heels in. He had
So, can you compare, like, in the 60s, we had Hogan's Heroes and we had King? Remember that?
Well, I wasn't around in the 60s. But
Yeah, neither were most of you.
I wasn't either.
But I've watched Hogan's
There were
Heroes.
people injected into regular broadcast TV, 3 networks, and that black people were just there. And I mean, and we didn't make a big deal about it. And so
Sometimes we did.
But I think the point really is in a lot of those shows.
Spear Chucker Jones
characters-
might disagree with
right.
you.
Those characters were caricatures without
Mash.
much, without
Spear Chucker
much
Jones.
depth.
Mash.
Yeah. But there were a lot of shows, especially those shows in the 60s and 70s, where the characters were there. You saw characters of different ethnicities, but if they weren't white, they weren't given a lot of depth in their lines, or they weren't given a lot of screen time. It depended on the show. I mean, Star Trek is one of my favorite shows, and so and Nichelle Nichols was a trailblazer as far as that went, but there were shows that it was just like, oh well, we got this black guy in the background, we'll give him 2 lines and he'll seem like an idiot, and they do a stereotype, and that went through, that still happens. So but it just depends on the writing.
He's had a lead in one whole episode.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean,
Meanwhile, sorry. No. Well, speaking of Star Trek, so that was very well intentioned, but that was an example of how things had not yet evolved. Because if you go back and you watch the original series, yes, Uhura and Sulu are there, and most of the time that's all they are.
Yeah,
they're there.
They're
the
there.
story is about it's about Kirk, Spock, and Bones, and sometimes Scotty, and they're just there. You'd be hard pressed to find an episode that's about one of them.
Right, and when you do see them, they're kind of pawns in somebody else's game.
Yeah. And sticking with Star Trek was the vision from Gene Roddenberry for Star Trek was envisioning an ideal world, and in that ideal world there was diversity and inclusion.
Yes.
And because of that, there should be people on these ships.
Right.
What I think a lot of us in the diversity community have been saying is that we've always been here. You just haven't been paying attention, right? So the people that built this country would like to be represented in the stories of this country. So I think that we keep referencing Star Trek, but Star Trek comes from a really different place than I think a lot of the modern diversity is trying to come from. So I think that merits mentioning. Not to poo-poo Star Trek, I do love Star Trek.
No,
It's doing it. I think
it blazed the trail on its own to kind of get us in this direction. You had
So you guys talked about studios underestimating the audience, and I had questions about that because it seems a lot like people are very, very worried about taking us outside of our comfort zone, and they almost act like we're hysterical babies. But at the same time, you get a lot of vitriol and venom aimed at people who are just doing their jobs. Like Mary Kelly Tran was bullied
Kelly
off.
Marie Tran.
Mary, sorry, did you say her name again? Kelly Marie Tran. Okay, I reversed it too. Kelly Marie Tran was bullied off of Twitter. John Boyega had an entire post where it showed him kicking a lot of hate comments he got. And then with the new Star Wars series, people freaked out about there being black actors in it. People flipped out about there being black hobbits. They flipped out about there being a black elf.
Here's the thing, though; those are a very loud minority because the fact is, all those properties still are extremely popular.
And I'm wondering, does it just seem like do these people are oh, there's 25 or less of the population acted like they hated this, so let's not do it? Or is it where, how much of the vitriol aimed at it is a very, very loud minority, and how much, I guess I'm wondering how is underestimating the audience partially based on this very loud minority, or is more of it just extreme caution around possibly losing any money or getting any bad press at all?
I think that question is multi-layered because at the end of the day, the studio's going to look at the dollar amounts. They're not going to. They're going to be like, okay, so did we put in this? We've got this. Yeah, we got this pushback, and I don't even know. Did Disney even really defend her?
Probably not. I know with John Boyega's case, people were yelling and screaming the minute the first teaser
Remember the
for the
And he
first,
stood up and he
but
just
like literally all he did was stand up, and they're like, "Oh my God, there's a black
I
stormtrooper."
cheered so loud.
The studios are still like, yeah, we're going to continue the Star Wars franchise, and we're still going to continue to create characters. But then now I'm wondering, is like, are they pulling back because of the pushback? But I do think it's just a very loud minority, and they're just making it awful
Because like the fact
online.
is, whatever you want to say about the new Star Wars trilogy, that franchise made a lot of money.
Yeah, at the end of the day, the studios really don't care unless they're making money.
Yeah, it was the same with the Rings of Power. Like, people acted like it was such a big deal, then I watched it and I was like,
it's still
these characters fit in so seamlessly into the world.
And there's a Black Hobbit.
Yeah, and I mean, the Black Hobbit.
Yeah.
A single Black Hobbit, a single Black Elf.
And the thing was, what I liked about it was they had the Hobbit main character, Nori, is played by a Caucasian actress, and she has parents, and one of them is played by a black actress, one of them is played by a white actress, and then she has siblings who obviously look like the black actress Hobbit. And I was wondering, I was like, how are you going to work that in there? And then they put a line in about how his first wife, Rose, died, and then he remarried. But Nori calls, I can't remember if her name is Marigold or Lily, which I thought was very interesting. He marries two women in a row, and they each have a flower name. But
it's probably a Hobbit thing.
It's a
It's probably less Freudian and more Hobbit.
They're
Harfoot. Yeah. They're not hobbits yet.
That's her mom, and then there's such an integrated part of the community and so built into the story, and no one questions it, and yet people are like, this doesn't make any sense, I don't like it. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, isn't it weirder that when you look at the original movies, they all look so Scandinavian? Because my mom, who's Mexican, was watching it, and she's like, why are there so many blonde people? And I was like, you're right, that is odd. So
Right? It does feel more
in a way,
weird
the
when
Rings
they're
of
all...
Power. In a way, the Rings of Power kind of made more sense to me visually, because I was looking at it and I was like, yeah, this is like what I see every day in my life. Like,
right, you're seeing representation, and in a way that is just incorporated without like hitting you in the face with it either. It's just, this is the way the family is, and that's the.
You know, an interesting thing about Rings of Power, though. Here's another bias that I feel like a lot of us don't even realize we have. Those Harfoots are given weird Irishy accents, and you can bet the Irish have like. So they feel some kind of way about that.
Something to say with always being associated with dirtiness.
Exactly, that these like, soul of the earth, like Irish types. But meanwhile, the Peter Jackson movies, they didn't do that. Like the Hobbits had a variety of accents just based on where the actors were from.
Well, and the dwarves did too.
Yeah, exactly.
Tolkien wrote that based on the Celtic.
Yeah.
Right? So I mean, that's why it started out like that. And the first movie just followed that. I don't think that there was any intentional.
At the same time, you know, we have the opportunity in this whole new century to update things.
Sure.
Like, you don't have to
And
adhere to something written.
Fine.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think we should criticize the way it was done before, because that's just.
I wasn't criticizing it so much as it's like you don't notice it, and then when you think about it, you're like, that is odd. Like, I don't think on purpose he's like, I want it to look super Scandinavian, but I think when you're looking at it from a certain perspective, you're like, that is weird. And then when you see the Rings of Power, you're like,
I would love to hear from casting directors from some of those to see with how much direction they got on what type of look and background and everything that they were looking for, or if they were just like, we need to cast elves, and that casting director went, I want all blonde elves in this area, right? Where the decision making went on that,
and also the thing is too is because of certain words being ambiguous, like you could say the elves were fair, and that can mean they were very good looking. Or
I was
could mean
thinking
they were
about
blonde.
that because they said fair, but that doesn't mean that they were fair complected. It might mean they were fair and isn't pretty.
Yeah, and then there's also like, because Tolkien did a lot of like massive detailed world building, he would have different groups of elves, different characteristics. So it makes sense that like not every single elf is going to look like Legolas, and not every single Harfoot is going to look like the Baggins.
Correct.
Because that's what happens with humans. Like, you have a group of people who are like, you guys are Italians, and it's like,
that. I think now we're
some of us
falling
look like this,
into
and some of us look like that.
Now we're falling into something where I think the studios are underestimating us, because nerds tend to understand a little bit about genetics and biodiversity, and so so we are sitting and we're thinking and we're seeing that and being like, okay, why are there just a bunch of blonde elves? Blonde is a recessive trait,
Yeah, it is.
and so
I mean,
Very close
Arwen and her
to
dad
the
had dark hair.
Yeah.
which-
So
Thank
why
God.
didn't
No, the
anybody else try?
Yeah.
But there's a reason.
So yeah, no, and that
Let's
makes,
not forget this is all fantasy. We
Yeah.
can do whatever we want.
that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true.
And the
And
thing too is
Biggest
like the
counter.
argument of like this is Celtic or this is Nordic or this is British is if you look at the Vikings, they were incredibly widespread and they were in Afghanistan, they were in Russia.
they were in China.
Yeah.
Oh, but they were there to get slaves, so let's not.
I'm not
And
saying
they weren't there
were
to
like
do Burning Man Part 2.
I'm
they were slaving in
Now
those
what, right,
regions.
that's
because they're
the
because
Vikings
they
and
were
Vikings and
older.
Burning Man.
Yeah.
And some of them would like stop robbing people and would be like, okay, I'm going to be a farmer and I'm going to marry in now and I'm going to stop being like a crazy murderer.
Yeah.
Or, just raping and
Or, yeah,
there
or-
being
yeah.
products of that. You know what's
Yeah.
interesting is if you
Raping
go
would be a
to
different-
Central Europe, there are a lot of very Asian-looking Europeans, thanks to certain invasions that happen.
And speaking of that too, I just looked this up the other day. The word for slavery comes from Slavs, Slavic. So I thought that was really interesting. That's like I have Croatian blood and stuff. And I was like, oh, people they don't even know that was legal.
Yeah, I think that might have to do more to do with the language of the slavers over time than the nature of slavery.
Yeah.
The languages the slavers themselves would have spoken over time, as opposed to the nature of like the history of slavery.
That was a prime hunting ground for the Vikings for a long time.
Yeah, I think they really were.
It was, and that is only one type of slavery from one population.
There was more
So,
than just.
yeah, slavery goes back a long, long time. Slavery is biblical, so I think that would go back a little bit further than the Vikings. And I don't think they use the word Slav in the Bible. And if they did, I'm not sure it would then have its root in Scandinavia.
Does anybody read Aramaic?
I have no idea. Yeah, I definitely don't. Nor do I read Hebrew or any of the other languages. It
I
would
know
have been
someone who
written in,
reads
but-
Hebrew, but I can't get him.
Yeah, not an
Because
old
there
enough.
were people enslaved in the Bible, right? That Moses freed them.
Yeah, yeah.
What did they call them? They didn't call them.
I wouldn't know. I think a lot of times people use the word slave, as like an implication that
I'm trying to remember what the Latin word for
I don't know what the
Here, Google.
I don't know what the consequence of that fact is. It's interesting, but I'm not entirely sure what the consequence is because we know that slavers weren't entirely white, nor were slaves entirely white, and nor did slavery start in Scandinavia. So I don't know what the implications of the history of the word is. Like all geysers are named geyser because of the geyser in Iceland. But I'm the
Right,
one
yeah.
called geyser. Its name is geyser. But I'm not quite sure what the implication
Like
of
where
that
it
is.
is.
Like why? You know what I mean? Is it
Yeah,
because
like
that's the
if
first
that
one we
didn't come
noticed?
first.
Servus.
Yeah, is it a nice
Service
name
in
that
Latin.
we like?
Yeah.
So we were like, geyser, that's fun to say. I don't know, like the first dude who took a good picture.
Here had something you wanted to.
In the Scandinavian Vikings, I once went through I guess it was a kind of a meet yourself for Scandinavians, but they told me some interesting things. For instance, the raiding parties, which brought in wealth, people felt strange about that within Viking culture. For, one thing is a poem about the wife who laments about the ocean and ships going out as the old gray widowmaker. I.e., a lot of those Vikings went out and never came back.
Yeah.
And this didn't always sit well with their culture either. So they would think, yes, it brings in wealth, but it also gets rid of some of our best young people.
Right, but this is the story of humanity. I mean, since the advent of civilization and adventure and voyaging and economy, people have been going out in groups to raise their economy and not coming back. It's a very long story, and the Vikings are just a part of that. But that leads me to real quick. Now we're talking about representation of Europe in a way, the history, and this is something that I think that we kind of touched on, is when we're bringing diversity into fandom in a way, in science fiction, fantasy, and movies and television and books. As authors, you may or may not be consciously writing in your poetry. When you say I, like you said, when you say I, they assume you're talking about you, but let's say you were, when you bring that in, how much of the history and the background of the community do you bring in when you're talking now? I know Stronger Than a Bronze Dragon, there's so much Chinese mythology kind of.
Here's the thing, I made that all up.
Right, but it feels, it's got a lot
I made
of feel from Chinese mythology.
Inspired by things I heard as a kid, but I actually purposely did not look up any real mythology because I didn't want to mess with that. I'm just gonna make stuff up based on the vibe I remember my grandma telling me about when I was 5.
So, but there was a history there that you're kind of pulling from, even though you're making this up, right? You're pulling it from a history of the folklore that you learned or you heard from your grandmother, right?
I guess.
In a way,
inspired,
inspired, right? So we're pulling from history, but Tamsin, when you write about other communities or other characters, and you're trying to develop a character that has a background that's not your own, how much of actual world, the history of the world that they would have grown up in or they would have been in, do you, because you said you did a lot of history on research on this one. As a historian, my interest is, okay, how did we get here from A to up here? So how does a character get here? You know, because it not just their personal history, but there's cultural history. There's this background, and like
sometimes
the Vikings,
it's a mixture of them.
Right.
So I've got a shape-shifting raven. He is he's a skinwalker, and he comes from a tribe in Alaska, where the raven is their totem, and his entire and certainly he shows up in this story, and that was actually very important to me. How did he get to New Mexico? Like, what's this guy from Alaska doing in New Mexico? Like, let's answer that. Like, so when you were saying, you know, do we get to know the background? Do we know why?
Not necessarily his personal history, but you know
right.
where he's coming from in a way. Yeah.
Right, and it had to do with the fact that I looked up and I chose a tribe that most of them had been killed off because a bunch of the white men gave them pox, gave them the smallpox and blankets that were infested, and he got out. And then it's a story about, he talks about, I did a lot of research. Of course, you don't give all of it in the book. I'm not going to go on like 10 pages. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I researched when he would have come into New Mexico and how he was found when they moved the Apaches into Fort Sumter. Like, that was important to me to show the what had happened, how he ended up taken care of. So yeah, I do the research for all of that, even though you guys may not see every little bit of it on the page. If I'm going to bring a character in, I need to know that cultural backstory. I need to know about them and what makes them tick. But I have a theater background,
right?
Where I used to run a theater company, and I was an actor. So for me, it's important to know that inner dialogue, to know that backstory.
We only have a few more minutes left, but this kind of wraps up. I think we're coming back to how can we better represent in media and I think it's that understanding even just a little bit of the generational point to where we've gotten with this character and developing them as a person, and that's every character. That's regardless of ethnicity or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to need to wrap up. So because we've only got a couple minutes left.
How did that?
But
it's always happens with these kinds of panels.
I'm happy to go down and get a drink. We can talk more about this.
I was going to say,
or stay. The next panel's about representation too.
There's wine and cheese though for us if we want.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
You guys are doing the marble.
Yeah.
So they're already here.
What about cultural appropriation?
Oh,
that was the 4 p.m. panel.
That's whole separate can of worms. Yeah.
I'm like, we're not even starting. We got 4 minutes. Yeah. There's no
what
way.
Vikings had dreads? Yes. Yeah. It's a whole separate conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry if that was dismissive. I didn't at all mean to be.
Okay.
So I had 2 observations. One, when you said but Vikings have dread,
Mm-hmm.
there's actually someone on YouTube who talked about braided hairstyles in Europe versus in African cultures, and she said that's not true. They did have braids, but they did not.
No.
It's not from the same place. And then she talked about Polish people who were discriminated against because of their hair cultural practices, which I did not know about. And then she talked about the primary.
Have you heard Polish jokes though? Everybody
primary
Polish jokes.
Sources that described people's hair that people looked at and they were like, oh, this is clearly describing African hairstyles. And they were like, this is from the point of view of people who thought that this group of white people, the group of white people hating another group of white people, they described it like this because they were like, look at how backwards these people are, and like that's not where you want to like base your argument. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was you talked about in the last panel I saw you in about how when they adapted the Grishaverse, they threw in like a bunch of prejudice.
Random racial slurs.
We also talked about Avatar: The Last Airbender, and when they have prejudice in there, it's clearly boiled into the world making. Like, people from the Southern Water Tribe are going to be treated badly by Fire Nation nobility because they spent like the last 100 or so years trying to wipe them out, both culturally and physically. And then it's clearly baked in there. So I guess my question was, how do you make your world, if you're going to put prejudice inside of your made-up imaginary world, how do you do it in a way where it's not a misery, one, it's not a misery narrative, and two, it makes sense. It's not like just like
Make
this
it
one
part of the
character.
world building, because the issue with Shadow and Bone is that it was not part of the world building. Like, the nation that the main character was supposed to be half from, and that's why they hated her, it was barely mentioned. It was like, oh, she's half like Shu Han or whatever they called it, and we don't like them, so that's why we're going to start calling her a rice eater and this and that. But it wasn't part of the story. Like that, if that war between her ancestral home and her current home was a major plot point, then yes, maybe those things would have made sense, but it wasn't.
Or Mudblood. Mudblood's a great example.
Yes.
Yeah, and then also,
I think we're literally out of time.
We are literally out of time, girlfriend. So sorry.
It's not like just one group that's hated, because in the real world there's like multiple like specialty hatreds we all indulge in, because humans are horrible and weird.
So I just want to wrap this up as something that popped into my head that I probably should have addressed at the very beginning. A lot of the stuff that we're seeing now is a shift in the power dynamic, because when you have a group in power, that's what you're going to see. And so now what we're seeing is a balancing. It's not there. This is my opinion. You can disagree, but I feel that that's the part of bringing representation into our fiction, is to understand that someone like me, for example, is coming still from a position of power in society based on what I was born as. As a white woman, I have more opportunities, but it's changing, and I think that's where a lot of the pushback is getting, is that people are pushing back, they're recognizing that there's a change, and they don't want to lose the comfortable place where they are.
That is
and they haven't understood that you don't, if there's no room at the table, you build a bigger table. You don't kick people off. So that's my last rant. So
I have some postcards up here if you want something to find me later. And I'm selling books in there tomorrow. I have some books with me. So.
Thank you for listening to the Creative Play-In Podcast Network. If you enjoyed our show, please check out D&D Journey of the 5th Edition and Ragnarok Enroll a Scion Hero to Ragnarok Story. Also, check out our Patreon page for more content and behind-the-scenes things, as well as joining us for a one-shot game or two.